Begin, and let me, on behalf of Harvard University, the John F. Kennedy School of Government, and specifically the Center for Science and International Affairs, welcome you to a special forum event on religion and values in public life, in which we're looking particularly at a recently published book and its argument. The book is entitled Religion, the Missing Dimension of Statecraft. And I must confess that if you were to do your Kennedy School curriculum carefully and thoroughly, you would probably find that this title accurately describes our curriculum. Okay? Now, this is not entirely accidental, because the principal author and co-editor of this volume, Doug Johnston, was in fact the first director of the national security programs here at the Kennedy School, of which he's a graduate. And as we go on further into the introductions, after I've introduced Doug, you'll find there's even other Kennedy School connections. But here is this book, Religion, the Missing Dimension of Statecraft. It's Oxford University Press. And the reviews of it and discussion of it has been mounting as one sort of watches either magazines or newspapers or other foreign policy discussions. So I think there's no question that the authors of this book have identified an underappreciated, understudied dimension important in the shaping of international politics, maybe particularly in the post-Cold War environment, and underattended in most of the academy. As one of the commentaries says, this book fills a critical gap in the analysis of the religious dimension of conflict and provides for the American foreign policy community in particular insights into successful interventions by religious peoples and organizations in the peacemaking process. Well, to talk to us about this, I'm going to call on first Doug Johnston, and then after Doug has spoken, I'll introduce the other members of the panel. Doug is currently the Executive Vice President of CSIS, the Center for Science and International Studies in Washington. He served, as I said before, here at the Kennedy School as the first director of our national security programs. He was before that a naval officer and a submariner. He's spoken around the world on this topic as they've been rolling out this book, and he's a good friend. So let me turn to Doug Johnston.
Thank you, Graham. It's really a great pleasure to be here. I dreamed up the idea of this when I was here last over 10 years ago, so being here today is a particular pleasure. It's sort of like going full circle, sort of like religion itself, where the Salvation Army picks a poor fellow up out of the gutter, the Baptists wash him off, the Methodists organize him, the Presbyterians educate him, the Anglicans introduce him to high society, and then the Salvation Army picks him up out of the gutter. It's also a great privilege to share this panel with my colleagues here, because the very first person of substance that I spoke with when I was trying to get this underway was Ann O'Donnell, who at the time happened to be at the CIA, sort of looking at the whole business of religion and political instability with a particular focus on liberation theology. And Ann had she'll be introduced by Graham more properly, so I will cease there. But Brian Hare was part of the initial oversight committee as we were trying to get this thing underway. Gave some very insightful recommendations at the beginning, and Ed Lukbach was on the steering committee through the execution and authored 2 of the chapters of the book itself. So it's just a great privilege to be with them today. Well, the book itself, which Graham gave you the title, represents the culmination of a 7-year effort to explore the positive role that religious or spiritual factors can actually play in preventing or resolving conflict while advancing social change on the basis of justice and the rule of law. It stemmed from an awareness of a great deal of good that was being done in different parts of the globe by religious officials and spiritually motivated laypersons in reconciling differences between disaffected factions, and in some instances actually bringing wars to a halt on a very low-key basis, almost invisible. It also stemmed from an assumption, either right or wrong, that the very vigorous constitutional separation of church and state in the United States in particular, but in the West more generally, so relegates religion to the realm of the personal that we're almost embarrassed to even talk about it in any sort of a professional context. I think that in turn has led to a general insensitivity on the part of many of us, including policymakers, of the degree to which politics and religion do intertwine, and quite deeply, in different parts of the world. I submit that that in turn has probably led to some uninformed foreign policy choices, where we've gone into places like Iran and Lebanon and really haven't fully understood the dynamics of what was taking place. Now, conventional wisdom has it that religion is a divisive influence in the affairs of humankind. I don't think anyone would quarrel with that. The absolutism that attends religious convictions just most of the time doesn't lend itself to negotiating compromise. But it's this more helpful aspect, the aspect of introducing trust in a third-party capacity, that has been largely overlooked for the last couple hundred years, primarily as a result of Enlightenment prejudice. And when you look at the nation-state model that has served as the paradigm for international relations ever since Hans Morgenthau articulated it in the late 40s, you find that religion is barely mentioned and only in passing. Nowhere is credence given to the passions that religion generates. And when we first started out, I thought this would be a relatively simple and straightforward proposition, exploring the reconciling influence of religion. Got into it just a little ways, it became very apparent that this was a very complex, many dimensions, many nuances. And what we were talking about was no less than making the case for a new paradigm for international relations, a paradigm that would recognize and perhaps build upon the contributions of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and even individuals. And if you think about it, we're living that reality today. It's just the political theory hasn't caught up with us. When the former foreign minister of Norway, Johan Jorgen Holst, brought Arafat and Rabin together, it was outside the model. When Jimmy Carter has done his thing in North Korea, in Haiti, in Bosnia, it's outside the model. So you see, we are living that reality, but until the political theory does catch up, I think that many of us, particularly in the policymaking arena, are going to continue to miss those opportunities for reconciliation that do exist if you give this stuff the time and attention it deserves. Now, in recognition of this complexity, we put together a steering committee of world-class scholars and practitioners from a range of disciplines, extending from political science to theology, to religious studies, to psychology, sociology, foreign affairs, even military strategy. You name it, this book is informed by those disciplines. And I must say that the strength of this book is the collaborative nature of it, where all of these disciplines do come together in an interactive way, and I think develop a synergy of their own. Now, the committee felt that the best way to convince that uninformed foreign service officer or the skeptic would be to illustrate through a series of case studies exactly how this phenomena has worked in different parts of the globe to good advantage. And we therefore have a series of 7 case studies. These case studies include 3 that are about nonviolent struggles for political change. Now, these are struggles that most assuredly would have turned violent had it not been for the church asserting itself in a very strong way to keep them nonviolent. And I must say, as Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. and many others have discovered, strategic nonviolence can be a very corrosive agent to an oppressive regime. Well, the first of those case studies, one that most of you are familiar with, I think, was the role played by Cardinal Sin in particular, but the Catholic Church more generally, in the peaceful transition from the Marcos to the Aquino regime in the Philippines. The second one had to do with the role of the Lutheran and other churches in the revolution in Eastern Germany in 1989. And there you find that the churches were not only providing sanctuary for the dissidents, but they were very specifically aiding and abetting that dissident spirit. And indeed, between the regime that existed before and what exists today, that transitional government, the roundtables that constituted that government, were chaired for the most part by Lutheran pastors. The third such case study of that trilogy was the role played by the churches in the abolition of apartheid in South Africa. It's very interesting there because it was the Dutch Reformed Church itself that provided the theological justification for apartheid in the first instance. The English-speaking churches at the time voiced their opposition when you looked hard at generally how they lived their lives out, they lived them out on the basis of social apartheid. However, within the Dutch Reformed Church itself, now that's a generalization, there are exceptions. Desmond Tutu leaps to mind right away. But within the Dutch Reformed Church itself, there were people who stood up and spoke their conscience. The most prominent of these was Byers Naudé, who was destined to become the leader of the DRC. And he spoke out against it. He was vilified, ostracized by his peers, formed a multiracial group to oppose apartheid from start to finish. And all of this culminated in a meeting in Rustenburg, South Africa in November of 1990, which 80 denominations and parachurch organizations were present, and they were talking about the future of South Africa, where it was going to go. At that meeting, the DRC spokesman stood up and said, apartheid is sin, and we have been guilty of distorting Scripture to justify it. And he asked for forgiveness. And Desmond Tutu, who was present at the time, said, well, in the good Anglican tradition, if my brother asks for forgiveness, I have to forgive him. Well, then the next couple of days were consumed by various individuals standing up and reciting their own guilt in having tacitly endorsed the status quo and asking forgiveness. And a lot of that was flowing around the room. All well and good, but there's a reality to life, as is always the case. And one of those realities is that there's a sizable black faction even from the church communities that don't buy it. They said this was cheap grace. Forgiveness is one thing, but where's the restitution? So I suspect until some of these thorny issues like land reform are satisfactorily resolved, the jury will be out. Now, the three next case studies had to deal with ending wars already in progress. First of those was a case of Biafra attempting to secede from Nigeria, and there the mediating role was played by the Quakers. It's interesting that a number of organizations sought to play that role, but only the Quakers were accepted. Three reasons for that. First, the Quakers have a long-established track record for peacemaking, and everyone knows that they have no agenda other than their concern for the human suffering that's involved. Secondly, they operate on the basis that there's a spark of God in every individual, and they treat them with the respect that should command. And finally, they've cracked the code on the fact that the degree to which they will be effective is inversely proportional to the degree to which they seek credit. Therefore, they operate on a very low posture, low visibility basis. I might also say, too, that one other reason you didn't find anything until this book in the open literature about this stuff is because confidentiality is almost always a precondition for this kind of activity. The second case study of those three had to do with the war that was going on in Nicaragua between the Sandinistas and the East Coast Indians. And there the Moravian Church played the mediating role. Now, the Moravian Church was very close to the Indian culture. Indeed, in many villages where there was no elected mayor, there was a Moravian pastor who served in that capacity. So you might ask yourself, well, why would the Sandinistas agree to let that group be the mediator? Well, there's an element of realpolitik here where they were trying to address the problem of a two-front war. As you may recall, they were fighting the Contras at the same time, which this country was supporting. Well, that church formed a conciliation commission, and there were other church officials from other denominations involved as well, but they did bring it to a halt, and Jimmy Carter went down, put the icing on the cake, oversaw the signing ceremony, and the Indians returned to their homelands. The next case study had to do with the transition from the white government of Rhodesia to the black government of Zimbabwe. And there, three castes of characters were involved: the Catholic Church, the Quakers, and a network of spiritually motivated laypersons called Moral Rearmament, or MRA as I will refer to them. Each of those groups played complementary roles. There was very little overlap, but those roles extended over a long period of time in which they were trying to bring a very brutal civil war to a halt and then effect this peaceful transition. And one moment in time that was rather dramatic was that the day before the reins of government were to be turned over, the Ian Smith, who was the leader of the white government, was poised to initiate a white coup. And armored personnel carriers were on the street corners. Everybody expected the streets to run red with blood. And this Moral Rearmament had put together a group, a cabinet of conscience, they called it, that had been meeting for a number of months, included folks from all walks of society, some high officials and others. But the nephew of one of the inner circle of Mugabe's group suggested that perhaps if Mugabe and Smith could meet, that could prevent what was going to happen. Well, Alex Smith, Ian Smith's son, was a member of Moral Rearmament. He got his father to, in fact, go to Mugabe's headquarters that night, the night before they were going to turn this over. And the next day on television, both leaders came out speaking of peace and reconciliation, and that's the way it carried through. Now, it was a very charged atmosphere because for months Mugabe had been publishing a death list, and you can guess who was number one on the death list, Ian Smith. So, again, I wouldn't suggest that there was necessarily any sort of spiritual transformation that took place at that meeting. I think what it did provide, though, was a way for these two men who were seeking to avoid what seemed to be the unavoidable to have a face-saving way out. The final case study has to do with the role played by this same group, Moral Rearmament, following the conclusion of World War II. Frank Buckman, who was the head of MRA, in fact, he formed it in the 1920s. It's called the Oxford Group, formed it at Oxford University. He had quite a network of individuals, including a number of anti-Nazi Germans throughout Europe and other parts of the world. He felt very strongly that as that war came to conclusion, if Europe was going to avoid a repeat of what had taken place twice before, that he had to achieve some reconciliation between the French and the Germans. So he got a band of like-minded Swiss citizens to group together and to buy an old hotel, Grand Hotel, on the side of a mountain above Montreux, Switzerland, east end of Lake Geneva. It's a very grand place. Kings and queens, Maharajas used to frequent this place regularly. It's a place where you can't help but think heavenly thoughts as you're looking out over the Alps and the lake. It's an incredible vista. But in '46, when nobody wanted to talk to Germans, it was almost impossible to talk to them because you couldn't bureaucratically get them out of Germany. He was able to pull that off and started a dialogue over the next several years between some 2,000 French and 3,000 Germans. These were industrialists, labor leaders, preachers, teachers, the people who constitute the very fabric of society. And they came together, and out of that process, Konrad Adenauer and Robert Schuman met. And of course, they are the ones who jointly gave birth to Jean Monnet's European Coal and Steel Community Plan. Now, MRA would make no pretense of having had anything to do with that plan, but it's crystal clear that that plan could have never taken hold had it not been for the reconciliation achieved across industries and labor unions. So out of these case studies, we sought to extract principles that would be useful for policymakers. And these range from sort of looking at the temporal power of the church all the way to that spiritually motivated layperson operating almost totally independent of any denomination, and what that spectrum of capabilities represented and what sorts of situations they might usefully make a positive contribution. And then we go into a chapter on implications for the foreign policy community. There I would just generally say, based on our research, at least up until then, that time in the past, that a combination of dogmatic secularism and economic determinism combine to create a learned repugnance toward contending intellectually with anything to do with spirituality or religion. That's just sort of an overview. Ed Lukbach will be talking much more to the foreign policy dimension. We then follow that with a chapter on the implications for religious communities. And there I would just make one comment, and that is that there are tremendous underutilized assets in the religious communities out there. I draw the analogy between the church that stands empty 6 days a week in order to be used the morning of the 7th. That's probably about the ratio there. There's only 3 denominations I can name within Christianity that are really committed to this as a calling. Matthew 5:9, blessed are the peacemakers. You find most other denominations, there are pockets of activity here and there, but there's an awful lot there that could be brought to bear. I'm not talking about just internationally, but even at the community level, the local level. So the last chapter is called Looking Ahead, and we try to apply some of these principles to ongoing situations. Punjab, Sri Lanka, Northern Ireland, and former Yugoslavia. And on the latter note, we have tried to operationalize this concept, to walk our talk, so to speak, by putting in place at the center where I work, which is Center for Strategic and International Studies, not science. He's got science on the brain here. But we put this program in place. At the heart of it is a conflict resolution team that's international in its composition, and we've been for a year and a half now on the ground in Bosnia, Croatia, and Serbia, conducting conflict resolution training workshops. If we have time, I hope I can tell you more about that during question and answer period. But I just wanted to mention one vignette in that last chapter that I think can serve as a useful model for much of what is likely to happen in the future. And this has to do with the role played by a lay Catholic community based in Rome called the Community of Sant'Egidio. And this community was providing humanitarian assistance in the terrible civil war that was waging an extended period of time with lots of casualties in Mozambique. They saw that what they were trying to do was meaningless unless they could try do something to bring a halt to the conflict. So they went about winning the trust of both sides, and they did things that governments would never do. They took guerrillas to their first dental appointments. They bought them their first spectacles. They won their trust. They got them to the negotiating table. And they started a series of talks. And they also are very far-sighted, very shrewd bunch of people. They foresaw that they as religious peacemakers or track 2 diplomats would not have the wherewithal to monitor a ceasefire agreement or to guarantee multi-party elections. So in the 9th round of talks, they invited in official diplomats as observers from 4 countries. The U.S. was one, and the United Nations. And in the 10th round, they officially passed the baton. Well, those diplomats brought the resources of their respective nation states to bear and, oversaw the signing of the agreement, monitored the ceasefire, guarantee the elections. Today you have peace in Mozambique with a democratically elected government. So you see that combination there where official diplomacy can build upon the contributions, the trust that the religious element can provide. Now, I would just conclude by saying it's important not to overstate the significance of this. It can't work in every situation. And I would just briefly suggest two situations generically where it does work. First is where you've achieved some sort of proximate alignment between the secular planets of the political, economic, and security factors. That is to say, you've made sufficient progress on each one of those fronts to enable a breakthrough at a higher level of trust, which is what that religious third party represents. The other time is when there is a stalemate and there's no progress at all. And here I cite the example, it's not in the book, but back in the 70s when Chile and Argentina were about to go to war over their mutual claims to the Beagle Islands, or the Channel Islands as they're called. An invasion order had been given. The warships were just hours apart. A cable went to Rome. The Pope sent an envoy. Once the Vatican envoy appeared on the scene, the passion subsided. It took the envoy 6 years to work it out, but these two Catholic countries didn't have to go to war. So it was a face-saving way out. I think I've run out of time, so at this point, let me turn it back to our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doug. I think that we'll sell some books just on that basis, and I think that we look forward to further comments back and forth in the discussion. Let me introduce our second member of the panel who will make a comment on this, who's one of the authors of chapters in the book. Edward Lukbach is among the most original thinkers in the strategic community today. He's a senior fellow in preventive diplomacy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I apologize. Edward I've known for many years and admired. He can think of more ideas on most subjects than most of us in a day than most of us can in a month or maybe even a lifetime. Whether he always sorts the ideas as clearly as we would like is a subject he and I love to debate, and he makes the same argument about me, so that's only fair. Edward's the author of 8 books, including most recently a book entitled The Endangered American Dream, How to Stop the U.S. from Becoming a Third World Country, and How to Win the Geoeconomic Struggle for Economic Supremacy. A number of you have otherwise seen his book on the logic of war and peace and on strategy. So, Edward Lukbach. Thank
you. Publishers put the strangest titles on one's books, if one lets them, which one shouldn't. You just heard the warmly positive, or I should say normative and prescriptive dimension of this book about dimensions. But the book itself is actually written not warmly but in a cool way. That is to say that great care was taken in revising the case studies to make sure that they were seriously documented, and in eagerness to show things work, one shouldn't play fast and loose with the facts and so on. My own introductory chapter attempts to explain why it is that by the time we reach recent events in Iran and Lebanon, there is the ability to witness large-scale religious convulsions and not see them as such. You may recall that even press reportage of the Lebanese civil war laughably used to speak about left-wing and right-wing. There were Druze chieftains fighting Maronite chieftains, and one lot was described as left-wing. There were feudal leaders, in fact, traditional, hereditary, feudal leaders on both sides, and one was described as left-wing, one as left. Well, it's a very interesting story, of course, and when Doug Johnston first came with this idea, it was entirely his idea. I was immediately interested in collaborating with it very intensely, because I had been bothered about something which is of no practical concern, but for a long time, and that is the mysterious fate of Byzantine studies in the West. As you all know, by the end of the 16th century, enormous progress had been made in Byzantine studies. Magnificent volumes had been published on all the documents and texts and everything. And then they simply disappeared until after the First World War. A handful of people kept them going. And the reason, of course, was that this period from the end of the 17th century till our own century is... You could, in a very crude way, say that this was the period of Rousseau, that is the period of self-realization, universal ideas, and ideology, as opposed to, again, to be almost childishly crude about it, a Vico period, not Giambattista, Giambattista Vico, but rather Rousseau. Vico stresses particularity, identity, culture, and so on. And out of the domination, what happened in a big world out there, where the main events were not in fact controlled by identity, religion, or particularity. This was a period of great ideological struggle, culminating in a communist struggle. These were highly, of course, completely universal. Particularity was suppressed, efficiently suppressed. It was a struggle between communists and Democrats. It flattened cultural differences, racial differences. It was, in some ways, a very elevated experience for mankind to be universalized to this extent. But when this, let's say, Rousseau lost and Vico won, and the great unifying ideologies and counter-ideologies collapsed, and so that there was a gradual emergence of identity, particularity and identity, the practitioners of foreign policy, the elites that do foreign policy, had completely lost the ability to recognize this phenomenon. And hence we reached the final unbelievable sort of misunderstandings attending to Iran. You may remember that in all these firmly secular-minded people watching the Ayatollah Khomeini's agitation rising in Iran, believed that what he wanted was constitutional democracy. So they were pressing the Shah to give him a constitution and so on. In other words, there was a blatantly religious phenomenon, and all these people going around with towels on their heads and wearing robes and talking about Allah, and the remedy was, well, of course, they can't really be after some religious aim. They must be after constitutional rights, and here's the pressure on the Shah. But what happens, of course, is that the phenomena cannot be ignored. It's too blatant. But what happened was what I called a secularist reductionism. That is, where you have a religious phenomenon and you explain it as economic, an economic phenomenon or some other conventional thing. Now, there are three things that ought to be done. Doug Johnston has spoken in a very prescriptive, normative way about the third thing, which is to utilize, if we are living in a period of Vico and not Rousseau, then we should utilize this for the purposes of the normal policy purpose of a status quo power like the United States, which is to maintain the status quo, oppose conflict, stabilize it, and bring peace, reconciliation, whatever you like to say. But there are two other things that need to be done. The first thing is that we have to recognize these phenomena. There's much less secular reductionism around than there was even 10 years ago, but there's still a lot of it. We have to simply recognize it. In the book, we even make an administrative prescription that there should be religious attaches in some U.S. embassies, for example, just to recognize the fact that in a lot of places, a lot of people running around doing things on that kind of motivation, and if we have a labor attache and so on. The other thing we have to do is we have to seriously examine these phenomena in a more sophisticated way than the practitioners, not the practitioners, but the theoreticians have been able to do so far. The anthropologists and Orientalists, and they don't call themselves that anymore, but area study people and so on, I'm afraid producing some very, very crude descriptions of it. I mean, let's say these Bala in Lebanon, to mention something in these week's events, they're described as religious fanatics. The motivation is that they believe so much in Islam that they do this or that. Well, clearly, when people are going around firing rockets, what they're trying to do, they're trying to endow the gods, their Allah, with the power that Allah conspicuously doesn't have. Allah is supposed to be very powerful. His devotees are supposed to be given victory because he's so powerful. Well, he has not been delivering for the last couple of 100 years. He's just not been delivering. So they, unlike Christians post-Christians, let's say, who say God is dead, I wish he was alive, but he's dead, they're not willing to settle for that. So they are acting to make Allah powerful so that they have a reintegrated, functioning Allah to whom they can then submit to and sublimate themselves into and so on. So that these things have to be looked at in a serious, grown-up sort of way, and to start making sense of them and how they're functioning, whatever the purpose of that may be, and notably including the purpose of peacemaking. This is not something that can continue to be handled in the awfully superficial way that the area experts are handling it, let alone the newspaper people who then set the elite opinion, which then sets policy. Policy is made, in that familiar sequence, and at the very beginning already we're dealing with crudities and superficialities. You can then imagine, which is not, of course, the case. We do health policy on the basis of elite understandings of the basics of medicine, but that originates in a fairly serious attack on the problems at the scientific level. Then it gets into the media circuit with some distortion, finding and so on. In this case, even at the source, there are crudities, simplicities, and superficialities. So this too has to be handled. One word about the MRA chapter I did. I went to the actual hotel, chateau, above Montreux, and I found all the archives there. And it was a wonderful example of somebody who is a believer, as I'm not, would find this a wonderful evidence, the workings of providence. Because what happened is that these MRA people out of England, a handful of them, wanted to bring French and Germans together. They had the basic good idea. They got visas, permits for them to go to Switzerland, where both sides, French and German, got to eat the first butter that they'd eaten in 6 years. Butter, you may think it's a joke. I don't like butter myself, but after 6 years of war, to be fed butter and chocolate and so on made a big thing. Now, the providential hand was, in effect, that Buckman's and the MRA's, this handful of people's connections, happened to be heavily in the coal and steel unions of France and Germany. They had connections with the trade unionists in the coal and in steel in France and Germany. So the French and Germans they bring together are very heavily people from the coal and steel trade unions, who then came together, and of course then there still were pre-nationalization in France. There were still steel companies and so on. And in Germany, of course, there weren't steel companies. There was all Allied military government property, in effect, but the unions therefore run the show, and you have Franco-German reconciliation starting, or efforts to make to start in 1947, with coal and steel being very, very prominent in this. And then, of course, Schumann, who was a devout Catholic, follows this development. He's very much in contact with what's going on. And out of this amalgam of things and pressures and counter-pressures and allied needs of getting coal and steel going, the whole thing comes together. It's rather a fun episode in the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Edward. The third member of the panel is from here at Harvard, Brian Hare, who's a professor of the practice of religion and society at the Harvard Divinity School. Brian has taught regularly in the national security program here at the school, almost from the point when Doug was here. He served from 73 to 92 in Washington at the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops and at Georgetown University. At the Bishops' Conference, he was the director of the Office of International Affairs, and towards the end, counselor for social policy. At Georgetown, he also served as the Joseph P. Kennedy Professor of Christian Ethics in the School of Foreign Service and at the Kennedy Institute of Ethics there at Georgetown. So we're very pleased to have on part of the panel Brian Hare.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be part of this program. This is the second panel I've had an opportunity to be part of to discuss the book, one in Washington. And I was glad to go to Washington and glad to come across the yard here to Harvard because I think the book has fulfilled a very useful function. I think to some degree the title's too modest in terms of the functional role that the book can play. It talks about the missing dimension of statecraft. I would want to argue that there's a missing dimension of the study of statecraft also, so that if you read the title of the book, you get a sense that the problem lies with foreign policy bureaucracies and their inability to grasp the religious dimension. But I think it is fair to say in an academic community, in a sense Graham Allison has said it first, that bureaucrats who studied in the standard places to study foreign policy would not be given a great deal of encouragement to grasp hold of the religious dimension. And to some degree, that's in a sense what I want to look at is the reason for that, why this is a missing dimension both in the craft of statecraft and in the academic analysis of statecraft. And I think it's fairly easy to get hold of it. I did do a kind of informal survey since I have given this, I've been asked to give this kind of talk more than once. So one day I decided I would do a kind of anecdotal survey almost. I walked across in my library and I picked off 7 volumes that deal today with international relations theory and international politics generally. So I went through the 7 in terms of their indices to see religion. So I looked up religion. In 6, I found nothing. In 7, I found religion, page 189. So, I mean, that was sort of the extent of 7 volumes of the study. And these are standard texts, not textbooks, but analyses of international relations. Now, it's not enough to sort of just stay with that. Where do you find the roots of this, and how do you connect it to what's going on in international relations today? I think one way to connect it, not the only way, is to look at the fact that the international system today is not only going through the transition from the Cold War to the post-Cold War, it is going through a second transition that's been going on much longer, and that is what scholars of international relations call the transition from the Westphalian to a post-Westphalian world. This refers, of course, to the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, whose function was to settle the religious wars in Europe. But in the discipline of international relations, of course, it is understood that the legacy of Westphalia was to give us 3 component elements by which we understand world politics. The first, the sovereign state. The second, the principle of non-intervention. And the third, less analyzed than the first two, was Westphalia's attempt, I think, to separate religion and politics rather decisively. And indeed, if you had been an architect of the Treaty of Westphalia and just been through the religious wars in Europe, separating religion and politics would altogether seem to be a helpful thing to do. The purpose, I think, was to make sure that religion was not to be used as a casus belli. That is to say, no longer could people refer to religion as a reason to go to war, and interesting enough, as a reason to intervene in other states. So the Westphalian argument involves separating religion and politics. To some degree, the 18th century democratic revolutions reinforced that separation because they established societies that were based on the principle of religious freedom and the principle of religious tolerance, with a secular state mediating among various contending groups in a pluralistic society. What grew out of that model was an assumption that religion is private. There are the public affairs of society and the private sphere within which the principle of religious liberty protects the right to be religious. But the assumption, I keep saying assumption because none of the major religious traditions would accept this notion that a religion is intrinsically and exclusively private. But the assumption grows up that there's a public sphere and a private sphere, and religion fits in the private sphere. Now, once you translate that, a combination of Westphalia plus the 18th century, once you translate that into analytical terms, what that means is you can analyze world affairs without attending to religion, and you will not miss anything, because religion has only private significance. So if you're trying to understand the major analysis that goes on, the major trends in a region, in a state, or in the system as a whole, you look at political questions, strategic questions, economic questions, perhaps legal questions, but religious questions are not necessary to analyze because that fits into the private arena. It does seem to me, not unlike something that Lukbach said, if you look at the empirical data of the last 25 years and ask what would be helpful in foreign policy analysis, it is very difficult to sustain the model I've just outlined as a helpful model for understanding the world. For you try to understand Latin America over the last 25 years without the Catholic Church. You try to understand South Africa without Bishop Tutu. Try to understand Eastern Europe without either the Lutherans or Solidarity or the Pope, and you try to understand why people get so excited about Jerusalem without understanding religious conviction about why Jerusalem is important. So there is a way in which this is not, I don't mean this is kind of conspiracy, this is just kind of a blind spot in terms of the analysis. Now, what's interesting, I think, is that you have to go beyond critique. At a certain point, you've got to move from saying this is not being attended to ask what it would be an analytically sufficient way to examine the role of religion. And here, in 10 minutes, of which I have exhausted 7, you are not going to get an adequate analysis, and that's a good thing to hide behind, I guess, because I probably don't have an adequate analysis. But
We'll give you another minute.
Well, no, Lord Graham, you're not going to get me into that model. I would argue that one of the ways to think about this is to think at least about a functional framework for understanding religions, and then you have to use what I think a philosopher would call an analogical principle. The functional framework would be to say that I think all of the great religions have 3 component elements: ideas, institutions, and a community. Now, you have to use an analogical principle because when you compare things analogically, you are comparing 2 things or 3 things or more, things which are somewhat the same and yet totally different. So if you use an analogical principle, you look for the common ground, the somewhat the same, even though you recognize you can't collapse one tradition into another. But I think if you look at those 3 things, ideas, institutions, and a community, you look at the resources that religious communities bring to the world of international affairs. Ideas are obviously convictions, convictions of faith or convictions of faith and reason. It depends on the religious tradition you are studying. But these are ideas in religious traditions that determine, at least for their adherents, what things are worthwhile living for, what things are worthwhile dying for, and at times what things are worthwhile killing for. So they are ideas that powerfully motivate people's conception of what you can do in an ultimate conception of life and stay on a track of internal integrity, if you will. Secondly, there are institutions. Again, it depends on the religious tradition that one is examining. But I would submit that one way to think about the role of religion in international politics is to recognize that in international affairs today, all of those 7 textbooks that I talked about recognize the growing salience of non-governmental organizations. And they also recognize the salience of what is called transnational actors. Now, transnational actors have the following characteristics. They are based in one place, present in several places, have a trained corps of personnel, a systematic philosophy, a single systematic philosophy, and a sophisticated communication system. And that's IBM, Phillips Petroleum, and the Jesuits. All of them fit exactly all of those characteristics. And so you have a place to locate religious institutions in the secular study of international politics. They are transnational actors with the specific difference that they bring to bear to their transnationality ideas, particular forms of institutions, and so then you have to examine the various institutions in the tradition. And then, of course, finally, community. The final thing that a religious tradition is about the people who believe the tradition and live by it. But that takes you into a description of looking at the pluralism of the community, what its convictions are, what the patterns of authority or lack of authority are in the community, how those communities are either encased within national actors or constitute transnational communities of conviction. But it does seem to me you need that kind of matrix. And so my own sense is that it is easy enough to make the case that there is a missing dimension. That, I think, is a case that is not yet fully accepted everywhere that it will make a difference, but it is not hard to make that case. It would probably be a harder case to make the case of what analytical grid would be an adequate way of looking at religion, and not only looking at it in itself, but integrating it into a larger framework of the study of foreign policy and international relations.
So a good challenge, Brian, and I think that actually our cleanup hitter may even begin to help address this. Ann O'Donnell is a Kennedy School graduate. Indeed, she's the first and I think maybe only joint MPP Divinity School student. And I remember her very well when she was a student in my course back almost a decade ago. Having done this odd thing, namely studied at the Divinity School and also gotten an MPP here at the Kennedy School, she went to work, of all places, at the CIA, where she was, her responsibilities included trying to understand religion and political instability. So she not only presumably thought this was a missing dimension, or somebody did, but that there needed to be some grid or some answer to the questions that Brian is being addressing or been posing that might appropriately be addressed. After a decade of a very distinguished career at CIA, Ann has just recently left CIA to become Director of Business Development at Greystone Technology, a high-tech firm in San Diego. So we're very glad to have back at the Kennedy School an alumnus, and we're also interested in the practitioner's view on whether this might actually be applicable. Thank you.
I can't tell you how rewarding it is to be here in this forum with these two issues coming together after experiencing 3 years of intellectual schizophrenia between the Kennedy School and the Divinity School, going from Buddhist-Christian dialogue to the nuclear age, and trying to experience some kind of metamorphosis in between Harvard Yard. And for that reason, I invite whoever is here in the practice of ministry or religion or in the study of theology to spend a lot of time here. The students that are here are going to be the foremost policy analysts and leaders of political communities worldwide, and you have an opportunity to meet them here and strategize right here about the role of religion in international affairs and national security issues. with being mindful of the political constraints and strategic realities that dictate those issues within the set balances of power. I was motivated to get into this issue because I wanted to be the person that predicted the next Iran, that is, the next religious crisis that would have us so shackled and fettered that we were really impotent on the international scene. I wanted to be the one to warn the policy maker when the next one was going to happen. But I knew I had to understand a lot about the dynamics of religion and political forces. I remember one of my first days at the agency, a senior manager showed me a picture of a famous liberation theology priest holding an AK-47, and he said, you know, what are we going to do about this? And I looked at it. While the image is fairly disturbing on a personal level, I really didn't know what the national security implications were for this. And what I found was a real void of rigorous analytical thinking on how to think about religious movements and religious personnel exercising political action internationally. So I was seeking clarity. I was seeking clarity in a field that was underdocumented, underreported, and undercollected. For reasons of legal issues, the agency is prevented from actually having one-on-one contact with religious personnel, Peace Corps, and press. So we had to rely on people in the field as well as State Department, Foreign Service officers, military, and other government officials who were out there. There's a couple of things I learned very early on that I want to offer to you as assumptions that you should not make on this topic. One is there are no irrational actors. One of the things I remember saying, hearing someone say, well, that's irrational. How can we be in a position of being able to predict the irrational acts? Well, in fact, everything has its rational dimension. And within that parameter of rational action, we have to understand the values and the motivations and the strategies and the goals of each group and each actor. And so it was up to myself and a group of colleagues to figure out what were the parameters within which somebody would act, albeit irrationally from our perspective, but completely rationally within their own set of goals. And that was a paradigmatic shift for a lot of policymakers to get rid of that word. This is a rational evolution of what they're after. The other caveat is that this issue does not involve anything monolithic. The churches are not monolithic. And when I say church, I also mean synagogue, temple, Christian-based community. I mean religious entity. That it's difficult to understand the fact that religion and state are inseparable for us, but there are all kinds of schisms, sects, segments, and people who pool authority from various sources. So it's important to understand what the actors are that are in the country that you're looking at, what issues they're going to feel something on, how strongly, that is the salience for the issue, and what resources they have to bring to bear. And I'll encourage you to think about resources as broadly as possible. Inspiration is a resource. Money, of course, is a resource. Being able to gather at a certain place is a resource. Sermons are resources. The other caveat is that none of this has happened overnight. None of this should be a surprise. If we are watching the developments within foreign countries, we should know beforehand when something might be a problem for the United States, might be a problem for security for U.S. citizens traveling. So the question for me was how to alert a preoccupied and potentially ignorant policy community to the usefulness of religion and being able to assess religion, particularly for conflict resolution. And given that I spent time in the intelligence community, I didn't have a whole lot of authority to make policy comments. The State Department has the luxury of doing that. I was instead incorporated more implications. If you do this, this might happen, which kind of freed up my hand with a little bit more of a policy recommendation. And I took three approaches. One was to educate them, perhaps showing past successes of religious intervention. Secondly was focus on the groups, again, a group analysis of their resources and the issues they were likely to mobilize on. And then risk being predictive and prescriptive. And that was the missing link in a lot of the presentations to policymakers, is few people are willing to risk their analytical self out to say what might happen. The concern here obviously is going to be dominated by the fact that any religious movement might be anti-West. That was the way you got attention immediately. if you were going to talk about threats to U.S. citizens traveling or threats to U.S. interests. I devised a list of questions which I'm just going to run through. I don't promise that this incorporates everything, but they were useful for me to examine the question. I'll run them down and consider some of the case examples you might be most familiar with, and how this might bring some insights into the issues of the role of religion in some of the foreign countries that you might look at. I asked, to what degree is the church, mosque, temple, or synagogue an avenue for public expression? Is it de facto an avenue for public expression because there are no other institutions around? Or is it actually because of its integrity and moral credibility that it's a chosen avenue? Oftentimes the press is used also, or has that already been co-opted by the government? Is this avenue of public expression by the church supported freely by the government? And how is the church a voice different in this country versus transnationally? That gets to what is the relationship between a hierarchical official church within a country and perhaps larger institutions like the Vatican, the Congress of Bishops. On what issues is the church involved, and is there a consistent theme, for instance, social issues, debt restructuring? At the time I was looking at this issue, debt restructuring was very important. Nuclear weapons was tremendously important. How has the government responded to the church's role, and by what mechanisms? Repression, arresting of priests, tacit approval, protection for rallies and movements? And then who are the prominent religious activists and the personalities, and how have they changed over time? It was fascinating to me to learn that several of the people who came with a significant public image actually went to school together at certain Jesuit institutions, perhaps in the United States. Some of them studied together or were followers of certain cardinals, and you could really glean a lot of their motivations by their own intellectual history. And how have they changed over time? What may have radicalized them? What is I just focused on leadership. One of the other things I wanted to bring to the discussion was a focus on followership. And I think that's underrepresented in the literature and also by experts when they look at a country, is what are the issues that the followers are likely to move on? What are the issues that are not likely to move on? What may radicalize them? What keeps them stabilized and content? And what was fascinating to me is in the case of a few leaders, followers continued to follow even though their prophecy or proclamations failed. So this dynamic of perhaps a lie to the public, but they were able to sustain the following. Also, another question was, is there a relationship between the religious community's elite and the rank and file and more radical organizations? Under what conditions do the teachings of the church get translated into social action? Liberation theology was a good example of that. And then another angle was the nature of foreign aid or intervention, and our religious groups networked in any kind of assistance, that being humanitarian assistance or perhaps more less humanitarian assistance in the case of arms. And then competing religious movements. You have to look at the churches within a country as volleying for followers, and what might be some other issues that the church internal is looking at to preserve its own followership. I'm referring to the ascendancy of evangelical Protestantism, clearly represented a threat to the Latin American churches for the same group of followers. I welcomed the chance to see Doug's book being published. It was an opportunity to bring together a lot of thoughts from a lot of very respectable constituencies. I think this topic requires that cross-cultural contribution of the theologians, the priests, the special officers who have the background in the foreign service areas, the economists and the ministers and the negotiators and those who study leadership. I don't think that it's at all one trend, one kind of focus without the contribution of several disciplines to wrestle this very difficult problem. I have just one caveat that I think should guard any Western person looking at this, and that's that we should resist the tendency to draw upon our own tradition too much and being able to look at the dynamic of this in other countries, and that we should rely on an intercultural approach to this. Thank you very much.
And you didn't tell us whether you predicted the next Iran or not.
I haven't predicted it yet.
You can't reveal it yet. So, okay, we're open for comments and discussion, and let me explain to you how I propose that we do the ground rules. If somebody wants to have a strong disagreement, please, you're welcome. This is an open discussion. We would like short statements, though, and questions as much as possible. And I would encourage people, particularly on the aisles, to use the microphones so it'll get recorded. Please identify yourself and then put your question. This gentleman, yes.
Yes, hello. This topic, this discussion actually reminds me of a roundtable there was at BU a few years ago, which was called Religion and Hate. I think it was convened by John Silber at the time. And a point that was raised during that discussion, where there were representatives of the Jewish, Islamic, and Christian faiths, was that nobody represented other religions, other schools of thought, including, and in particular, secular thought, if you will. The idea was that in many cases, certain ideologies behave as if they were religions. And I can conceive of situations, for example, within the former Warsaw Pact, where you could have had conflicts between member states that would have been mediated by, for example, the Socialist International, much as cardinals would go and mediate conflict between Argentina and Chile. So instead of using religion, wouldn't conviction be a more appropriate word?
Good question.
I actually would like to add a comment regarding what Mr. Lukbach said that I feel very, very strongly about. The motivation of this book is that there hasn't been much study of religion as it impinges on the political sphere. Listening to what he has said, particularly regarding the Islamic traditions, which I belong to, I have to confess that I was raised a Muslim, even a Shia Muslim, although I've been educated by Jesuits and Jews in Baghdad, where I grew up a long time ago. I think that he would profit by looking more closely at the different schools of thought that exist within that tradition. He will actually find that there are a lot of people, even with towels on their head, who defend ideas that are very, very compatible with those that are enshrined in the Declaration of Human Rights and the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights.
Thank you.
This is, this is not a discussion about, who is right and who's wrong. It's a discussion about how one studies these phenomena. I was not talking about Islam. I was not even talking about people who strongly believe in Islam. I was not even talking about people who are described as Islamists in the contemporary literature. I was talking about specific beliefs of Hezbollah, that is, members of an armed movement at this time. I just spent a couple of weeks talking to these people. And so, your membership in the religion that is associated with the operational beliefs of people who are active in this. It is a difference between people who say, I believe in democracy, and, the kind of people who volunteered to go somewhere and fight and so on. It is a quite different thing, even though there's a general thing. As for the book, by the way, Doug Johnston's presentation, the contrast between his presentation and mine, will tell you, if you look at the book, you'll see this, is that the driving purpose of the book was not, in fact, analytical, but prescriptive and normative. Doug, as you heard him, strongly believes that much has been done, more could be done to achieve the kind of settlement of conflicts through reconciliation, which is achieved for that. And the Socialist International would, in fact, work in that model, in the sense that there was a set of beliefs, there was institutions on. Incidentally, the particular difference, the particular advantage of the religious operator that I don't think Doug mentioned is the explicit dissociation between that operator and the possession of power. In other words, religious fellow shows up in a conflict situation. He has the characteristics that were explained. I mean, he belongs to an international organization, perhaps very much like Coca-Cola, but he has no power. He doesn't threaten any of the parties and so on. So this is, that is the book, The Socialist International, would have worked this way if there hadn't been a Soviet Union or indeed a China, but only powerless entities in that sense. But otherwise, it would have been the same modalities.
A quick comment from Doug.
Yeah, just to add a note that would reinforce something you're talking about. One of the initiatives that this preventive diplomacy program that we've put in place is just getting underway now. We've just achieved much of the funding for is a study that will be authored by a very prominent Sunni scholar and a Shiite scholar, and they're looking back at the formative period of Islam, the 8th and 9th century, and they purport to be able to show the support for the human rights language of the Helsinki Accords. And the title of this project is going to be The Islamic Roots of Democratic Pluralism. And there's a lot of people who are very excited about this because those roots got a little bit turned on their head in the Middle Ages, and trying to get it back to square one. But what you were saying, I think, is right. There's a great grounds for in Islam for reconciliation.
Let me take this gentleman here next. We've got a longer list on the right than on the left, but we're coming here second.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Szabolcs Kerekváci. I'm from the Kennedy School. We have had a lot of interesting examples of what kind of a role the church can play in handling crises and kind of fire extinguishing. But my question is, what kind of prevention role can the church play? I'm from Hungary, and we can see a lot of signs of declining in morality in the past couple of decades after communism. And we are facing interesting events in Russia before the elections, presidential elections. So can the church probably play a more active political role as it did actually in Europe, in Central Europe, definitely before the Second World War? Would it be a solution? What kind of practical steps can it take in the future to prevent crises rather than only handling and the follow-up after crises? Thank you.
Brian, do you want to?
Well, I think the way to go about this is to think about the church as a social actor. That's not a sufficient description of any church or any religious group. You mentioned church, but any religious group. So that if you think about any of the religious groups as social actors, you will get a kind of phenomenological view of them at the outset. You then have to go beneath that to get at the level where conviction of faith and reason then yields the particular form of action they take. But I'd start with that. I think, secondly, the capability of any religious group is to some degree shaped by the content of their traditions, and secondly, by the culture and social situation in which they fit. So that, for example, you will find religious groups that do not think about themselves as highly activist social actors, that tend to think about themselves as providing a haven from which people can withdraw from significant secular activity and concentrate on a different level of meaning. At the same time, I think you can find religious groups, certainly the one I belong to, thinks about itself quite explicitly as a social actor, and what it tries to bring to bear is that mix of ideas and institutions which invigorate a community. The community, in turn, is presumed to be citizens within the society, so then you start to work out a mix of circulating ideas. They might be ideas about equity and justice, they might be ideas about rights, they might be ideas about the shape of the civil law. You build institutions that provide oftentimes an alternative to secular political institutions. Sometimes they provide a counterpart to them. Depends on what's going on in the church-state relationship. And then finally, you try and produce a body of disciples who are also good citizens, and good in the sense not necessarily of simply obeying what is, but good in the sense that they have a vision of where the society needs to go in light of the problems it faces, and they're willing to participate in that.
Greg, you want to put comment on this? No, okay. This gentleman, please.
When I think of the history of the world in recent years and all the trouble caused by Christian fundamentalism, Hindu fundamentalism, Jewish fundamentalism, Muslim fundamentalism, I wonder if the panelists in their approach aren't neglecting an important part of the role of religion in statecraft. I suppose I could cite numerous examples for the next half hour, perhaps in a sentence. In the past week, we've had Harvard visited by a Pakistani woman writer who's concerned for her safety if she hadn't left the country. We think of the Vatican's terming Clinton's recent veto of a bill as shameful. I guess Mr. Lukbach has referred to Hezbollah. I think a Hindu religious party is just about to become the largest party in the world's largest democracy. Obviously, I could go on and on with specific examples, but I think my question is clear. Thank you.
Good question.
My grandfather always used to tell me that the equilibrium of all things existent derives from the clash of opposing forces, so that the volume of conflict is always the same. It merely gets divided differently and expressed differently. It was inevitable that the downfall of universal ideology would simply result in the emergence of identity conflicts and definitional conflicts. So, don't be annoyed at religion. If it wasn't for this, it'd be something else. Because
how about, let me ask you, on extremism or fundamentalism, do you have any comment on this question?
I'm unclear at your question.
Well, the question is just the contributions of religious fundamentalism or extremism, whether Jewish or Islamic or Christian or others. We've seen plenty of examples. Is this now a new part of the trend? Now, Edward says, well, there's not enough international war going on in other dimensions, and so it's got to take place here in order to counterbalance. That's one theory. Have you an alternative?
Well, I never get the chance to theorize on this level. I think when discussing it with the colleagues, the small group of 12 that we had that would regularly meet on this issue of State Department agency, military officers, a lot of us thought that it was, we debated between it being a rollback to fundamental values and that worldwide everyone is trying to get to centrally the kind of things that really we believe in, back to family values, a struggle to identify more clearly that which is greater than we could possibly know, spiritual values. Then the other half of the group thought that, no, this is really a new era. This is a new way of thinking about a combined view of spirituality and public life. I don't think we came to any decision on that. In some cases, it happened in a vacuum of leadership, political leadership, and that the natural decay of one political institution forced people to fled to the institution that they knew best, that is the local church or the mosque, or so that you know.
Okay. Doug, you have a minute?
Yeah, I would just say as a point of further clarification, I mean, the book is very clear. It states emphatically that religion is a double-edged sword. It can cause conflict or it can abate it. There are countless shelves in libraries that are full of the cause of conflict that stems from religion. What was missing and what this book was attempting to get at was this more helpful role and to explore some of the possibilities for extending that helpful role on an even broader scale.
I mean, I think you have
There's
to...
no Jesuit extremism, right? No, please.
Well, not here, because I'm not a Jesuit. But I mean, I think, to be honest, I would bring to bear the principle of reason that I think stood behind your question, but bring it to bear on your question. I think you have an enormous variety of examples that don't all fit the label of fundamentalism, that need to be examined critically. I think perhaps your definition of fundamentalism needs to be examined critically. And if you get into that kind of analysis, that also is the best restraint on fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is not anything that belongs to any particular religion. It, once again, is a functional possibility in any religious tradition. It is also a functional possibility in secular traditions. Because all fundamentalism means, it seems to me, at one level, is to seek to insulate a conviction from rational analysis and debate. Now, there are multiple, I mean, the fact that Hindu parties come to power in India, I'm not terribly sure that's worse than Episcopalians in the United States. I mean, you know, in other words, the argument that a religious party ipso facto is some kind of massive threat, I simply would argue is an unexamined assumption.
The amount of killing by Muslims and Hindus of each other, not to mention other groups in India, is certainly very different from, I mean, in the United States we don't have Catholics and Episcopalians killing each other.
Right, and I have nothing wrong with Episcopalians. I was simply trying to highlight a cultural fact that we had Episcopalians that were very powerful in the United States. But, I mean, let us be clear. The killing of Hindus and Muslims, I think Mr. Lukbach has talked about secular ideologies of this century. Can you account for the number of killings by secular ideologies of this century?
Of the 167 million people in the century whom Zig Brzezinski claims have died in the political wars of this century, most of them have been because of secular faiths rather than religious. That is true.
Right, but I mean, my only point is, I'm not really trying to put down the question, but I am want to submit the argument that the emergence of religious themes equals fundamentalism equals a threat. That seems to me, at times, to be a prevailing assumption, and I think it needs to be met head-on, because otherwise you place religion in a non-rational conception of the world, and that eliminates your possibility to do precisely the analytical kind of work that distinguishes fundamentalism from what I would regard as rational conviction that might be able to enhance policy.
I was trying only to cite examples of fundamentalism having an evil effect, but I think it's only fair that I let other people have questions.
Thank you. This is a hot discussion, and we're not going to resolve that. Let me make an announcement on behalf of the chair, and I've asked Doug Johnston, and he says this is okay with him. Normally, we would stop at 7:30. Some people have other events that they have to go to, and they're welcome, and there's no problem for them to just get up and to leave. But we're going to remain another 15 minutes for the people who have questions that they would like to pursue, because there's clearly some active interest. And I apologize, but I'm just announcing now. This lady.
Yes, my name is Betty Ann Donnelly, and I'm a doctoral student in the government department. And I did my MTS at the Divinity School the same time Ann was there. Brian is on my dissertation committee, so I wanted to ask Doug Johnston, it seems to me your title, Religion, the Missing Dimension of Statecraft, that perhaps you need a companion volume to treat the other subdiscipline of IR, which is IPE, International Political Economy, because you focus in this volume on conflict resolution. And it seems to me that, especially now with the ascendancy of economic issues in international relations, that there should be reflection on the economic issues, and especially where the churches, I think, are the primary advocate of a cosmopolitan ethic. Charles Beitz, which some of us read in political theory, that the churches, and my study is on the Catholic Church and what it had to say as a transnational actor on the debt crisis, and briefly mentioned it, that these kinds of cases should be looked at. The church, the cosmopolitan ethic in the church's language is the preferential option for the poor, so that in the case of the debt, the poor who had nothing to do with contracting the debt originally should not be disproportionately paying the burdens of structural adjustment. So I interviewed Michel Comdessous, who's the current head of the IMF, who's a very devout French Catholic, and he opened our interview by saying, I just want you to know that the governing philosophy of my life is Matthew 25. How the poor is, how you treat the poor is how you will be judged. And his interview went from there. He was head of the French Catholic Student Association as a student in Paris, a very close friend of Cardinal Etchegaray, and close to the Vatican's Justice and Peace Commission. So I think there's a lot of material there, how individuals and groups, especially NGOs, have kept the cosmopolitan ethic, or have sought to keep it on the international agenda. So I ask you if you've thought about, and when you did this book, you concentrated on conflict resolutions, but did you think of doing IPE cases?
Only to the extent that the qualifier was preventing or resolving conflict while advancing social change based on justice and rule of law. But you're not the first to have raised this issue. And I see very clearly what you're talking about. I mean, it's I would not quarrel with what you're saying. Ed, you wanted to say something?
Just false consciousness, EMF, Comdessous, Christ, and deflationary policies.
Professor Mark Kleiman, who's a professor here at the Kennedy School.
Ms. Johnston, I greatly enjoyed your presentation, and I was thinking about the one administrative suggestion you made, trying to figure out what the operational implications would be. And in doing so, maybe it's possible to find an explanation for why the secularist bias remains, despite its obvious inappropriateness. Imagine the religious attaché in Lima, a Protestant or a Catholic, or something else, a believer or an unbeliever, or the religious attaché in Port-au-Prince, a Catholic or not, and if a Catholic, on which side of the liberation theology debate. Have you thought about those implications and the implications for the Foreign Service of needing to know the religious convictions of FSOs?
We have thought about it in the chapter on implications for foreign policy. You know, Ed was talking about if resources were unlimited, you could have religious attachés in countries where it's important, but you can also require your cultural attachés, who do exist, to have as one of their operating parameters being in close contact with the religious communities and trying to keep their finger on the pulse. And I was speaking at one point on this to a Flag and General Officers Mess, or 50 admirals and generals, and one of them suggested that perhaps that they, when we were trying to talk about how is this relevant to them, one of them came up with the idea they could use their chaplains in that capacity too. It's sort of a, you know, not just pure intelligence gathering, but a greater understanding of culture and what's going down in the community. It's very interesting. I just received a fax this afternoon about this Congressman Frank Wolf, who chairs the House Appropriations Committee, Subcommittee on Foreign Operations and Export Financing, and he was grilling Brian Atwood, who's the head of AID. And what he said here is, he says, the missing ingredient in Clinton's program is ignoring the spiritual aspect that is latent in that area. Unless you deal with reconciliation of these groups, this is Bosnia, reconstruction won't succeed. He continued to speak on successful reconciliation approaches, and then he suggested to Brian Atwood, if he hadn't read this book, he should read it. Now, I've never met Frank Wolf, but I certainly commend his insights. But let me just take, in terms of operationalizing the concept. What we're doing, I just want to talk a little bit about what we're doing in Bosnia right now. We've got this conflict resolution team that's been conducting these conflict resolution training workshops. We do it with our eyes open. We have no notion that anything we're doing is going to affect the current hostilities. After all, you've had joint pronouncements by the leaders of the Catholic, Orthodox, and Muslim faiths calling for an end to ethnic cleansing and end to the violence. And yet the beat goes on. And the reason the beat goes on gets to something Brian was talking about, is that religion is often co-opted by the forces of nationalism. It becomes a convenient mobilizing vehicle. But many wars that are attributed as being religious in nature really aren't. That's not what they're about. Even when you look hard at Northern Ireland, it's not really a religious war. But we've been very encouraged by what's happening. And we're in the sense that we're trying to plant the seeds for longer-term reconciliation, because we're absolutely convinced that no military or diplomatic solution is going to break the cycle of revenge. It isn't going to happen unless you have a spiritual component that ultimately gets at the business of forgiveness and reconciliation. That doesn't mean you don't have justice along the way, but you have to get at that. Well, we have two levels of workshops. In the second level, we actually try to convey these skills. In the first level, what we're trying to do is to get these people to help them pass their sense of victimhood. And it's not rocket science. We start with a very simple technique and storytelling. It's where you may tell the group about very terrible things that have happened to you and your family at the hands of my ethnic group, and vice versa around the table. And these stories are so terrible they do not bear repeating, but they evoke tears, they evoke compassion, and you find that after a little bit of this, there is a bonding that takes place, and people are at last able to see the problem through a different side of the prism. And after our first workshop in Osijek, Croatia, the group, 35 in number, without any prompting from us, came up with 16 initiatives that they were going to pursue on an ecumenical basis, ranging from influencing their political leaders in positive directions to multi-faith newsletters in the community to initiatives in the schools. And they are, I'm pleased to say, they're pursuing more than half those initiatives, and they're doing it on a cooperative basis. And after we have had the level 2 workshops conveying the skills, they have been absolutely euphoric and feel equipped to go out and be able to do something. And as a result of this activity, we're meeting monthly in the White House who are concerned about Bosnia reconstruction, and they see this as a tremendously valuable indigenous asset, resource, to have at our disposal to try to help get that situation under control. But that's one way that we're trying to operationalize the concept. You were talking more bureaucratically.
Well, I was talking more officially, and the question I just want to follow up with is, once one recognizes religious institutions as transnational actors and as therefore possible objects of diplomatic intervention, it seems to me you may be stepping very close to some important political fault lines. Well, at the point, I mean, if anybody imagined that Ray Flynn was trying to influence who got appointed a cardinal in some place where it was important politically, who was the cardinal, there'd be, I think, a lot of unhappiness. So, I mean, it seems to me that it's not by accident. It's no accident, comrades, that a country founded on separation of church and state, among other things, is reluctant to get its diplomats involved in other people's religious matters. And so, though I think your suggestion is very important, that diplomats have to take religion seriously, I'm trying to figure out how you can make that work without exploding yourself.
Well, okay, one minute each, because we're and we have all 4 people want to do. So please.
Okay. One thing you don't do is, as a government, you don't try to own it. You may try to reinforce it behind the scenes. In Mozambique, in fact, our government was very effective. Cameron Hume was the DCM for our embassy in the Vatican, and he was very helpful in getting that thing. It's a quiet reinforcement, but it's not trying to own that process at all. And Ray Flynn, in fact, I had conversations with him over in Rome. One of the things he used to do when he was mayor here is he said that whenever there was something going down in the community relating to conflict, he says, I always call on the church, the Catholic priest or the black community. They hold the power. He understood that's how he worked it. in practical terms.
Okay, less than a minute on the others, please.
According to the theory of some political scientists, it matters a great deal where you are in the bureaucratic setup as to the views that you hold. Some people on this table, not on the panel, have written a word or two about this sort of thing. In other words, you take John Smith of Beliefs Unknown, you make him religious attaché, and he's going to very quickly adopt the religion of that, slaughter the bureaucracy, and not the religion he was born into, point one. Point two, it's not the United States with its peculiar church state. The problem is universal. In fact, the French embassy, the British embassy in Tehran were writing almost, more elegantly, of course, but they were writing the same things, that the Shah's opponents wanted democracy and stuff like that. So, I do think it's very curable. If you have a fellow, who last week was culture attaché in Peru, and you send him to be religious attaché in Egypt, he's going to, do it, and it's not really a practical problem. If you don't have a person with that label on his visiting card, the issue doesn't get tracked. It's just,
Okay, Brian and Ann, both, you've provoked the whole group, but again, brief, please, Lee.
Well, I guess I would just distinguish between the personal and the professional capability. In other words, I don't think you have to be a Jew to study Judaism or to analyze it, or a Catholic to analyze Catholicism. Peter Nichols' book on the Vatican is one of the best books available on the Catholic Church. I think John Esposito analyzes Islam in a way that's intelligible and helpful. I do think there are personal things, but that's different. I remember when the U.S. ambassador was sent to Nicaragua at the height of the Contra thing, and he came in to talk to me one day, and he said, what should I think about it? And I said, the first church you go to on Sunday will mean a lot. Depends on which church you go to. There are different churches with different socioeconomic tendencies. They want to know where the ambassador goes. And I recommended that he go to all of them. But I don't think, all of the Catholic ones, I mean. But the final point, I would say it's a very different thing. If you're talking about U.S. policy operationalizing a church, I would resist that mightily from inside the church. It's a different thing trying to understand what's going on in the world.
Yeah, I don't think anyone said that a potential religious ambassador or religious attaché would work the churches. I think there has to be some structural way of having that expertise resident in country, because the reporting coming out of various countries is spotty and inconsistent. I remember there happened to be a very zealous agricultural attaché who liked watching the churches because he was out in the fields and it had a lot to do with the agricultural composition of the country. And he counted people that went, but the bottom line was he sent in great reports, but nobody cared because there really wasn't anything interesting happening in the country in a national security way. Whereas in other countries, you wanted that dimension and people didn't know how to collect it. So providing someone more sophisticated ways of collecting it. The other thing I want to offer is a quote that I think would be a nice way of thinking about this issue, and that is, we are not human beings trying to be spiritual. We're really spiritual beings trying to be human. And on that note, sponsors an ecumenism that really fosters great potential for resolution.
Okay, we have two last questions that need to be brief, and the answers also need to be brief. This lady, and I apologize for the delay.
Try to be brief. My name is Ariella Migdal, and I'm a senior at the college, and I think you've all four done a great job convincing us that in order to understand a lot of situations worldwide, we need to take into account the religious dimension. But I just want to push you, Mr. Johnston, on your second point, or your second claim, which is that to resolve, solve, or reconcile the situation, we can use the religious dimension to do that. And I think that paradigm, what I've heard a lot of the questioners say is to sort of push you on that paradigm and see how it works in certain cases where it doesn't seem intuitive. And one example that I would bring is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, where Yasser Arafat and the late Yitzhak Rabin relied on, although they both come out of religious traditions and are both a part of that, they both appealed in some ways to a secular-leaning pragmatism within their traditions compared to other factions in their traditions in order to come together to try to work out peaceful resolutions. And we see that sort of very fragile secular flavored peace being threatened right now by what the conventional wisdom and the press often call religious extremists on both sides. In other words, referring to these Islamist movements like Hamas and the right-wing religious Jewish movements such as the Gush Emunim bloc, the right-wing settlers. And I wonder how your paradigm would propose to harness or use religious sensibilities to address a conflict where the last best hope seems almost to be a secular pragmatism or a democratic wing within each side that have come together to try and work out something peaceful.
I thank you for that question. I would not quarrel with what you're saying at all, because at the end I said it's important not to overstate the claims, and for lack of time I wasn't able to say that one of the most difficult area for this kind of thing to work is when religion truly is an ingredient, because you have that absolutism that said, look at how Terry Waite fared. But on the other hand, that same lay Catholic community of San Egidio I mentioned, because of what they did in Mozambique, the Algerian opposition elements, many of whom were bitter foes with one another, approached them to see if they could help them work out a common framework for peace, which they did. And here's this Catholic community that helped these Muslim groups to come to cooperate. But it's the most difficult. I mean, what you're relegated to doing is, if you're in religion, is all religions have elements of universalism. All the major faith traditions have some version of the golden rule. And what you have to do is try to exploit the intersections of the specific warrants for peacemaking and conflict resolution that reside within their theologies. It's a tough order. It's a tough thing to do. And that's one of the tougher challenges for this sort of thing. So the optimum is where it's a secular conflict, but there's no trust. And that's sort of where it's the easiest to work.
Okay. This lady has the final question.
Thank you. I'm Gail Williams. Decades ago, I was here at the Kennedy School and at HIID. I'm very touched by the topic. I was touched in particular by two of the questions. And it occurred to me how important it is, just referring to your very last answer, that it not be seen that belief, even strong belief, spirituality, theology, conviction, not be seen as contradictory to tolerance and respect for other similar, very, very strongly held beliefs. It seems very, very sad that up until recently, or up until this moment, the secularity has seemed to be the only alternative, rather than respect and tolerance. And it seems that you have answered in many ways my question about how to spread tolerance. Is it, however, in some ways a paradox when we are trying to say, no, it's not necessary to have universal values to believe universally in tolerance? One of my biggest personal struggles is being tolerant of intolerance. And that's not sophistry. It's something that I think all of us experience daily. I would just briefly bring up something that's infuriating me now, and that is reading the book Ordinary Germans. Because whereas you are trying to go horizontally and bring statecraft and religion and find the interstices, I would be very grateful to know to what extent, if any, it's possible to make the vertical link among each and every one of us, billions of us, between individual tolerance, then percolating up, dripping down, God knows, hopefully he does, so that indeed we will have a much easier time at the level of state, of community, of family, internationally, etc. Thank you.
It's a difficult question to answer. In some respects, you're talking about the human condition, which in many respects is intolerant. But let me give you just a little quote here from, we have these little quips at the beginning of each chapter. This is by Richard John Newhouse. It says, "It is the will of God that we be tolerant of those who disagree with us about the will of God." So that's our hope that we can.
I think on that note, let me thank the panelists for a wonderful evening and mind expansion.